I suppose I would start with that statement. I mean, not everybody grows up in the same tradition or comes from the same place or the same starting point. And I was actually in a piece of work with a wonderful woman, Lisa Cherry, who'd been visiting Belfast. Absolutely brilliant woman. If look her up if you haven't seen her. And the work that she does on connections and relationships and rights. And we talk a lot about lived experience. Two things that you said that stuck in my mind was lived experience has become one of those buzzwords that I just start saying, please don't let me hear that again. It's like narrative, and sometimes I ask myself, what was the straight, honest to not fearing God word we used to use before we got into these click phrases that meant something when we first said it, and then means so many things it means nothing. So she used a sentence around lived experience that stuck in my mind. She said, you do not know what you have not lived. And I thought that just said much more eloquently what we mean by the importance of the things we have lived through in shaping the way we see things. And then she said another thing, which was about narratives and people with their own internal narrative, their own, thing in your head that tells you who you are and tells you who you're not, that's responsible for all your anxieties, and people call them your internal narrative, especially if you have to write up some kind of undergraduate work for Queen's. You're always advised to use internal narrative. And don't voice your own opinions till you get a degree because you're not worthy. You must, if you want to express an opinion, blame it on somebody you can adequately reference at the end. That's your get out of jail free card or get a degree card. But she said something else. Where do you think internal narratives start? Where do they start? And she put forward, they start in your external environment. They actually start outside you. And they're the end product of everything else that you're living through. So that statement for me about, this, I tell you, this is my body. Because I grew up in a tradition of going to the chapel every Sunday, and in fact, for periods of my life, because my mother went and I had to help her to going to the chapel every day, and hearing this, and I grew up in that ritual, and there were parts of it that were around comfort and solidarity and belonging, but there were also those ritual parts of it that came together in that very elaborate moment where the rest of us all had to kneel down, and His Lordship, the priest, held up the bread in this moment of transubstantiation or whatever it was going on there. I don't want to be disrespectful, and said, this is my body which was given, because the rest of that is, this is my body which was given up for you. And so there comes, I suppose, a time of reawakening when you say, shit, no, let's get this bit right. This is my body and it will not be given up for you. So I think some of the things of where we come from around the question of abortion particularly, and the broader question of reproductive rights, is that whether you grew up with that or whether you grew up with damnation unless you are chosen to be saved, all of us on this island have an external context that preaches to our internal womanhood that these are not our bodies, that we are vessels, we are vessels of the church. We are vessels of God. We are temples. If you're listening to that from your infancy, in a family, which my generation did. So if you think you didn't make any progress, wrong. Because not in fact, I would like to think that even within those, in terms of faith beliefs, that the depth of that day-to-day reinforcement that your purpose in this world as a woman is to be a temple of womanhood, a temple of virginity, until the need for reproduction comes along. And then this is not your body. Your purpose in life, your calling in life is to produce human beings for the world and souls for the Lord. And all of us, with very odd few exceptions, usually immigrants from England, may have had a different point of view in the 50s, in the 60s when we were growing up. So it's a very, very strong cultural pull against which we come as teenagers into the age of revolt. And, and we're into rock music, going to the pub, insisting that we are allowed to drink out of pint glasses, which we weren't. You wouldn't be served a pint glass in the pub. Being allowed to sit in the public bar instead of in a wee enclosure in a pub. There was an enclosure for women in pubs, and men ordered for them. So in that kind of context where you weren't allowed out in the street, when I was in my final year at school, and I was a good child, I just want to tell you that my badness in the world didn't. I was a late developer in unmitigated badness. I was a paragon of virtue, and I'm not lying. Hard work, virtue, and diligence, and adherence to the regulations until the civil rights movement came along. But your general position, as I said, at that time, and then you came into this new, strange environment where everybody was by and large revolting. And I suppose for young women, particularly who aren't into politics with a large P, but were into elbow room, were in this space before me. I hadn't time for elbow room at that point. My own life situation was such I had no time for elbow room. I needed to get through this university, get a degree, get the best job I could, because it had to be the best degree to get any job. Get the best job I could because I had my mother's children to rear. My mother had died in my third year at college. But the people into that space before me were effectively liberated by all of women being together, reading stuff, especially students reading Simone de Beauvoir and other people, seeing what was happening in Paris. And the development, which was, we talk about 1947 Education Act and what it had to do with the politics of here. For the politics of women and bodily autonomy, before we even came to the question of abortion as something you could say out loud, termination of pregnancy as something you could say out loud. You couldn't say sex out loud. And I'd ask any of you ever get a chance to see a one-woman show by a young writer and actor called The Daughters of Roisin. Make a point of seeing it, because she talks about this in her monologue. Nobody ever said the word sex out loud either. It used to be quite funny if people were talking. But nobody ever said the word was a dirty word. You'd be as well say shit, fuck, anything. But to actually say sex was almost an admission that you were a whore, if you would say it out loud. That was where we grew up, and then totally outside of our control, somebody invented the pill. And the absolute fear of sex leading to pregnancy was lifted. The absolute terror that any, and people weren't quite sure, the level of sexual ignorance and sexual innocence was very, very widespread. This was a trial and error job. There was nothing when I was at school. In the generation of my younger sisters, there was syllabus B. Syllabus B. That was just the name of it. There was syllabus A, of course, and then there was syllabus B. Syllabus B was for girls only. Boys didn't need sex education. Syllabus B was for girls. Syllabus B was how to keep your legs crossed, your mind focused on the Blessed Virgin, and stay pure until marriage, and if you had any wit, marry a man with a pioneer pin. Money in the bank. And if you didn't have a profession, at least if it would help if he played football with the GAA. Because at least then you might have what was called a good sitting. You might have a sustainable, economically viable marriage in which to rear children. So that's the context in which we all grew up. And then somebody invented the pill in the middle of a revolting, youthful generation. And did we go berserk? Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? So there was an explosion of sexual freedom for young women. It was great. From coming to a position where you don't do anything. So then in the early 70s, you had the women's movement and women's collectives. In very small ways, women sitting about in small groups, exploring their own sexuality, talking about things nobody talked about out loud before. And even then, abortion wasn't an issue. Abortion wasn't an issue that was openly discussed. Now, that's not to say that it didn't exist. Of course it did. Every town, every village had a woman who knew what to do. Every community had a woman who knew what to do. And a woman who did. And depending on how much she knew and how much she cared, the safety of the woman was entirely in her hands. And so you also had a position at that time of not only being dependent on the secrecy of the woman who did, although every woman who needed knew where the woman who did could be found, and increasing circles of secrecy grew. And so when you were young growing up, you knew. Have you ever discovered what makes people think about witches? It's this kind of society. You knew there were women who knew something you didn't. You knew it was something you shouldn't know. But you knew it had something that was secret and frightening and dangerous, and that it involved sex and women. And so there came another point in your life when you figured out what that was. And you either figured out what it was because you became one of those people and needed that, whether you were a young girl or whether you were a married woman or whether you were an unmarried woman and an older woman, you came to know, when they say you do not know what you have not lived, you only came to know on the basis of needing to know. And if you were lucky, somebody who saw your predicament helped you out. But that whole thing was secret and undercover. And if that wasn't what was happening, the alternative to that quite often was the mother and home babies and everything else. So the issue of abortion and the right to terminate a pregnancy being the right of the woman came very late as a public area discussion in the rest of that campaign. And like a whole lot of other things, and then I just have to set out my own anarchistic and far left, or just, I keep hoping every now and again I'll meet somebody worse than myself. But apart from one or two people of my same age, they're not showing up in big numbers. But it seemed to me that if it is my body and it is my choice, then I don't need this watered down to parameters and circumstances that are more socially acceptable to others. So if it's my body and it's my right from the start to the end. Now, whatever I do is my choice, but it's my right. So don't tell me to settle for the first 12 weeks, the first 24 weeks, a position where a fetus may not have any real chance of survival. Don't tell me these things will be acceptable, but making a choice for myself in any circumstance is my choice. It's also my responsibility. It's my choice. And so I've always, that's where it's been difficult. I've always believed in the fundamental right of any woman to secure a safe, a free termination of pregnancy and abortion when she asks for it, and that there's a full stop and an exclamation mark after that. That's it. That's my core position. And it's always been my position that, if it's my body, if it's my choice, then that's it. And you just can't have to keep your fingers crossed that I make a choice that doesn't offend the rest of the world, because my choice. But it came. But the issue around reproductive rights to terminate a pregnancy, to have a safe, free, and legal abortion, came almost at the end of the conversation of bodily autonomy. Bodily autonomy, the right to say no. The right to say no, thank you, came before that. Because the right to say no wasn't there when I was growing up. Wasn't there. And the safety and ability to protect yourself, was a 24-hour-a-day job, since the world was full of men. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I just think people need to know that when we come down to to this particular issue, which is the right, and the only reason that I say the two things together, the right to an abortion and the right to terminate a pregnancy, is I'm a believer in verbs. I'm a believer in doing words as opposed to passive phrases. So there's a thing like, if you have an abortion, it's something that happens to you. The right to make a decision to terminate your own pregnancy is a right. It's a decision, it's a doing word, and it's your right to do. So that's why I put the two That's why I put the two together all the time, because other people have, just have different views on which of those words you should use.
Yeah. The other thing I find fascinating when you're speaking about the backdrop of how you grew up is that you were one of, if not the youngest person that was voted into the Houses of Parliament, wasn't that right? And still one of the youngest, even now. I think Mary Black might be the only
Mary
person.
Black is the youngest. And there's a young fella, I think maybe, and maybe not, maybe she was the next youngest.
But I find that quite extraordinary that, the political system is still feeling us because there's no more people like you that are there.
It was an accident. And I have to say, in the same vein, people are now saying that this evening, how did Liz Truss get to be Prime Minister? It was an accident. People intended something else. People intended something else to happen. And that's what happened. And one of those things where people content themselves by saying, well, she'll not stop long. She'll do all right. We once had a school principal who was elected on that basis to be a school principal. They were putting the schools, amalgamating the schools over a 2-year period, and the principal resigned or whatever, and they put this other person in charge. And then I was on the parent board of governors and saying, don't do that. But everybody else said, no, sure, what harm could she do over 2 years? The schools didn't amalgamate for 9 years. And it was like Liz Truss on. But so that was the kind of attitudes, unfortunately, for moderate, decent human beings, that, I'd be elected. It was a by-election. And by the time the big election would come round, I'd be tired of it. I was a young female student. I'd probably be married. And then they would be able to get somebody. Because the only reason, like Liz Truss actually, the only reason I was there was that they couldn't agree between the parties who should be there. And I was sent by the People's Democracy to put up the line on revolutionary action. I was only learning it. I was a chapter ahead on what should be done as to why you shouldn't have a unity candidate, why you couldn't have an all-class candidate, why this wasn't the way to do the thing. And the more I was telling people, no, that's not the way I would do it, I ended up with the job. And so once that was done, the nature of elections being what they were, once there was a unity candidate on each side, it was a head count. And the battle was such that, there was a 95% turnout. This was a war fought in the ballot boxes, definitely was a row. And the more radical the things they said, I stood for the cancellation of the national debt, for comprehensive, secular and integrated education. Abortion wasn't on the manifesto because I hadn't formulated it. But if I had nobody was listening to anything that I said. They were voting against the other ranks. And I think they have made it much harder. I think they have... political parties have learnt not to make those mistakes. You now have to earn your passage in compliance. You have to be trained and honed before they would let you stand for the county council. So the opportunity, I think, the opportunity to do that may not easily come to young people. But I think there's also a different question. I did go there, and I tell you this, if you want to affect change, don't delude yourself that it's in those places that it's going to happen, and don't ever send anybody there that's less bullheaded than me or Mary Black, because the opportunity for corruption, the opportunity for coercion, for seduction. I don't mean sexual seduction. There are probably opportunities for that too. But into the system are overwhelming. They just, they are overwhelming. So unless you're very clear about what you're going to go in there to do, and unless you have an exit strategy for getting out with your integrity intact, I wouldn't advise anybody to take standing for electoral office with a view to winning, other than with deadly, deadly seriousness and self-protection for your integrity. I wouldn't go there.
And in terms of, bring it right up to now, the backdrop of nonsense, I suppose, of the political climate, and it just feels like the ordinary working person is just getting more and more of the responsibility of financial collapse put on them. And so how do you sustain yourself and each other in that resistance, or in that revolution, or in that kind of solidarity?
Well, there's a number of things I would say. You look around this room, we're still here. That's the main thing. We have a saying in Tyrone, the only day we're beat was the day we didn't show up for the fight. So as long as we keep showing up, as long as we're still in this battle, as long as we're not saying it's okay, and as long as we're clearly saying it ain't okay, none of it's okay, we're still in front. Jeremy Corbyn keeps saying we are many, they are few, and I keep saying to myself, Jeremy, well, how come we're not making big progress? But we are, sometimes we don't see the progress we made, because sometimes the only progress we can make is stopping them from pushing us further back. And that's why we have to show up every day, because the day we're not pushing forward is the day we are being pushed 3 steps back. And the day we delude ourselves that we are intellectually, rationally, humanely, emotionally, morally persuading the people in control, who are very few people. If we delude ourselves that they're going to be converted at some point to our way of thinking and say, God, I don't know what made me think that. I have no idea what ever made me think that the working class should be poor and the bond market holders should be rich. And now that you've pointed that out to me, Bernadette, I'll be forever grateful. That's never going to happen. Just never going to happen. Whatever it is they have that belongs to us, we have to take back for ourselves. There's not going to be a day when somebody is going to give people any kind of freedom. Financial freedom, economic freedom, emotional freedom, sexual freedom. Nobody's going to give it to you. You have to get your elbows out and do it yourself, and you can't do it on your own. So when you get your elbows out, you realise the only way forward is to link with the other woman who's got her elbows out. So I think, we have to show up, and we have to show up. And every single woman can't show up every single day. Also have to remember that. So we all show up collectively, but every single woman can't show up every single day, because life's tough. And the day that one person can't show up and nobody asks why, and nobody looks to see if she's okay, is the day we've started to lose. It's just as simple as that. Because we can't be that focused on showing up and moving the vanguard forward that we don't notice somebody has fallen. That we don't notice somebody can't come today to be brave and lead the vanguard. Because on this day, the world is falling apart. In here or out there, Or that at the minute that there are children who need fed and there's not enough money in the house. I was very cross with comrades and allies over the course of the week who claiming that communities opening their doors and inviting people to come in and spend the day with them and stay warm and stay connected with other human beings were humiliating them. That instead of doing that, they should be out campaigning that the government put the £20 back on the universal credit. These are not either or. These are not either or. These are both. And if everybody can't do everything, the old slogan of the 70s was, dig where you stand. So do what you can do. But recognize the value of what the other woman and other man and other person is doing. Do as little harm to your allies as you can do. Because I think the most disturbing thing that I see as my 7-year-old grandson thinks that we're all in the Rebel Alliance. He's obsessed with Star Wars. And he thinks his granny might be an elderly of the Rebel Alliance, as opposed to an old person. So the important thing is with the Rebel Alliance, we are fighting on a whole lot of different fronts. So somebody is maybe fighting and the mainstay for lots of reasons is the right to choose, is the abortion issue, is the reproductive rights issue. But if we're talking about rights, and this is my body, it's also my self-determination is also my right. It's an individual right. It's a collective right. So it's not for somebody out there in the feminist movement within their particular ideology to tell somebody else they are not a woman if that person says that they are. Yeah. Just not on. Not on. And there's no rocket science in that. You know, this is not a subject for a treatise, an undergraduate paper, a research, a podcast. No need. This is simple logic. If we believe this is my body, then I'll tell you whose body this is, what kind of body this is, and what I determine myself to be. And if you can't buy that, then you have to go and find the weakness, the flaw, the gap in your own knowledge, in your own humanity, in your own politics, because that's where the problem is. And if you don't figure it out, when push comes to shove, you cannot be relied upon to take this struggle forward. So you need to sort it out, or you will fall at some hurdle, and you will be dependent on the people over whose backs you walked to pick you up off the ground. And my experience has been that the very people who get walked over are the people who will pick you up, notwithstanding that you kick them down. And I'm not telling you things that you don't know, because I see all the heads nodding. All the wisdom is here. You know it. So not only do you not know what you haven't lived, you do know. You do know what you have lived. You may not have articulated, thought it through, and shaped it as, and recognized it as knowledge, wisdom, and expertise. But you do know, if you've lived it, you are an expert. You are one of Gramsci's intellectuals. I love that phrase. Gramsci's intellectuals. There are people who know more than people who have PhDs, but they don't let on because they learnt what they know in the school of life And I'm not being anti-intellectual in that, but what I'm saying is that the knowledge that is acquired through experience, that allows you to grow beyond your own self-interest, that allows you to recognize the universality of rights, that allows you to reach out and know allies, and know wrong from right, and forward movement from regression, is an expertise that comes from experience. And so the more you struggle, the wiser you get. It's not brave every day, but the more you keep going, even in small bits, even you have to stop to rest. The day you say it's not worth it is the day you're beat. And for everybody that's beaten, the rest of us are a bit weaker. So solidarity matters, not only because it matters in and of itself. You know, we believe in feminism, not because we don't like men, not because we think the world should be run by women. No, that might help. I'm not saying that it's exclusive, but it's a way of thinking. You know, feminism is not confined to women. It's an ideological way of thinking that is based on caring, on solidarity, on community, on however we identify those things as family. It is based on a collective, egalitarian way of thinking that recognizes individual right and collective responsibilities. And the day we stop caring about each other as individual human beings, the day I don't reach out to somebody because their politics are wrong, or because I don't think they should be counted as women. Trans women aren't women. I can't get my head actually around anybody who does think that. Or I was going to start this meeting by saying, just to get the temperature in the room, who's got a problem with sex workers doing sex work of their own free will and consent? Because if you have, then you don't believe this is my body. As simple as that. Now, I'm not talking about coercion. I'm not talking about exploitation. But it was my body. Oh, I once said in a class of young women, and they said, well, how far would you take that, Bernadette? And I said, look, I believe that every woman, if she wanted to, and any other human being, should be able to get out here and walk the whole way to the city centre, stark naked, preferably not on a cold, wet night, and not be subjected to ridicule. I'm not saying that it would be wise in this weather, but if you did it, you should not be assumed to be mentally ill. You should not be assumed to be a fair target for ridicule, for abuse. You know, that's the kind of world we should live in, that whoever we are, our fundamental human integrity should be respected by everybody else. And our personal integrity, our bodily integrity, and our bodily autonomy should not be challenged by anybody else. Because fundamentally, this is my body, this is my life, this is my choice, this is my responsibility. Now, because we're social beings, I make decisions that weigh up the choices I make for my greedy little self, if I want, in terms of the collective. That's feminism. That's socialism. That I weigh what I want against what is good for me and what's good for everybody else, and we come to a consensus of what's good for all of us. and we look after all of us. And that takes us back a bit then to say, well, how would we make that work? We need to own the means of production of wealth. just in case you'd forgotten about that bit. In order to resource it all, we need a democratic distribution of wealth and resources. And in order to get a democratic distribution and wealth, we have to take the ownership of the means of its production out of the hands of the markets, out of the hands of the big institutions, and return it to the collectives of people who use work and use resources as tools for the betterment of society, and do not use human beings as the tools for the production of endless amounts of money and power to satisfy insatiable greed. So I suppose feminism is socialism. You may not all know that just now. But if you keep going, you will see the intersectionality between women's rights, protection of women's rights, reproductive rights, feminism, socialism, human decency, feeding the poor, socialism. And Rosa Luxemburg said, and we're coming to that point in the middle stuff there, in the midst of climate change and things that are frightening. You know, if you're living in Pakistan, if you're in Somalia, if you're in Nigeria, these things aren't in the future. They're in the here and now. For women and children and men, they're in the here and now. But Rosa Luxemburg said, you know, in the last analysis, we're going to have to face a choice: socialism or barbarism. And we are headed, if you look at the leaders of the world, if you look at the drive of greed, we are headed in an increasing velocity towards barbarism. Just look at the Ukraine, look at Syria, look at Yemen, look at the manner in which the people who can say, before poor old Liz bit the dust, there she was, you know, with her big scheme, and then it wasn't there, and then there was a chancellor, but I have to own up here. I read the Financial Times because I have to know what the opposition are at. And it said in the Financial Times that whatever of the vagaries going on in Westminster, we can be assured that the bond market is in control of the UK economy. Don't worry, nobody needs to panic here. The bond market is in control of the UK economy. Now, what kind of democracy, apart from anything else, what kind of democracy is that? They own the Chancellor. The Chancellor will do as he's told. The Chancellor control. Not about a wonder, like he couldn't have a Prime Minister stay on there. So, if our whole democratic systems, weak as they are, have been hollowed out, what's the point of government? Never mind what's the point of Liz Truss. What's the point of government if the economy of a country is actually controlled by a high-class gambling den, which is what the market is? And within that, the vulnerability of women is that we are the disposable part of the labour market. Because going right back to where I started, it is the belief of the market. It is still the belief of the pillars of society, like the churches. It is still the belief of those who plan social and economic policy, that the purpose of women is the reproduction of the human race. And when human beings are needed, they'll be put to that task. And when they're not, they'll not be. But when we come to a need to push people back into the home, that's where we'll be going. When there's a need to put us out of the home, we might get a bit of childcare. And fundamentally, we are not even second-class citizens. I go back to poor old Thomas Paine, who was trying to create a bit of democracy. There's a wee bit of bad thinking in his head. He wasn't quite there. He was a very good man in his time. But he believed that people who had the vote, he was against monarchs and he believed people should have the vote. But the people who needed the vote were were able-bodied males who could defend the country and earn income. That was really people who had a stake in society. And because it was after the building of empires, he was trying to work out how many men of colour, how many black men, how many Indian men would equal the capacity of one white man. And white men could actually, if they had to go to war, a white businessman or landowner could identify two black men or 3 Indians to go to war on his behalf so that he could keep the country running. But when you look at it, at least the other men were believed to be somewhere on the spectrum of humanity, but women got no votes at all. And didn't get votes till very late because we are still, it's as deep a taboo, it is as deep a cultural fear in the maleness of our system that women should be equal in every respect. It's that deep concept in the whole culture of our world is as deeply embedded a taboo in its ultimate realization as incest is. I have no doubt about that. It is so deeply embedded across generations that the sky would fall down on Chicken Licken's head if we had absolute and unequivocal gender equality. It would challenge war. It would challenge coercion. It would challenge the maleness of power. It's such a deep... And if you think like that, you'll realise how big the battle is. So every day we win anything is a victory for the Allies. It needs to be celebrated. It needs to be held onto, and then straighten our backs and go again tomorrow. We have nothing to lose and an entire world to gain before the markets destroy it entirely.
It actually reminds me of something that infuriates me regularly is policymakers and economists. If you're a parent who's not in work, which is mostly women, you're described as economically inactive.
Yeah.
And I've never heard a bigger lie in my life as well.
I know.
Yeah.
There was at a time, and I'm never, they're interesting things, and I'm going to stop blathering here because sometimes my husband says, God, Bernadette, it was in good form till you started. I'm now totally depressed, the weight of the world. But there was in the 70s a movement around wages for housework. And I think maybe the modern equivalent of that is a basic income for caring, nurturing work. And that would be, that's for people who are described as economically inactive. If you look at the contribution that is made by carers for the elderly, whether that's parents or neighbours or whatever, if you look at the homemakers, the people who are holding the primary child development of their children, who are building the citizens of the future, who are building the cogwheels of future. If you think of it the way they think of it, then logically that should not be seen as a welfare benefit, but that should actually be valued above being a politician, for example, in terms of the contribution that it makes to society. I also think that those are things that I think come up in what some people call a kinder economy, a different way of looking at the economy, a feminizing of the way we look at the economy. So if we valued that, then and recognized that had to be properly resourced, we do away with child poverty as a stroke. Yeah. Child poverty would disappear if we understood that the single biggest resource we have, and big business tells you that, our biggest resource is our workforce. That's why we underpay them. We send them Christmas cards and remember their children's birthdays, and that'll do. And I do know workers that fall for that trap. Think I work for a great company. It sends my children, a corgi picking fall apart tie, like McDonald's Happy Meals on their birthday. My boss remembers my children's birthday. Oh yeah, he also pays me very badly, and I have to work overtime. If we change that, if we change the way we think about it, so around when we're talking about women's rights, because women are still the primary carers, and that's when we talk about taboos. I think we will have abortion on demand. I think we will have totally free childcare before we ever make any significant breakthrough on the basis that dad might actually be the economically inactive person at home. That's still a minority of households. And it's not fair on men either, but it's still a minority of households. So I think you're right, this idea that both women are economically inactive when they are doing that core job, but also paid labour for women is casual labour. And that's very deeply embedded in the Western culture, particularly, that women aren't workers as such. Women, when you're talking about workers as economic units of society, even though lots of women are working, there is still not within the understanding of economy that women are workers. If there was, then all workers who are parents or who have caring responsibility for others would have that factored into their ability to work. We also wouldn't look at people, people with disability. The disability, and it's a bit like the disability is ours. We talk about disability. The person maybe doesn't walk very well or doesn't walk at all. But that prevents that person from having the fullest potential that they can have in that situation any more than I can have in mine, because they are not seen. We're still stuck in that. What is a human being? A human being is essentially a male, able-bodied person who, if called upon, can go to war and in peacetime go to work. And everything else is a fraction of that. So we have a long way to go, but to hell, we're doing all right. I think we're doing all right. And I think, when I come as an elder of the Rebel Alliance and look around, one of the things that gives me, I just be enthralled at the courage, the open-mindedness, the warmth, the solidarity, the breadth, the wisdom and the bravery of young people. I'm talking people 16, even I'm talking about 16, 25, the people, there's a generation of people that society criminalizes. And we're in danger of criminalizing being young. You have to watch the young, you wouldn't know what they would be at. So make sure they're not out here without the police watching them in the dark. Always make sure that there's plenty of cops around where you see them congregating anywhere that could be up to no good. That kind of always happens. But I see, and I look back to my generation, we were young. And we were more foolhardy than courageous. That's the truth. Because we had no idea what the penalty was going to be. But I look at young people now, and they know what the penalty is. They see the world the way it is. They see there is no pathway to a PhD by standing up for people's rights. They see there's no way to make a fortune in defending the rights of your fellow human being. And they're living in a system that is worse than when we were growing up, totally tailored to penalising them for non-compliance and to seducing them into compliance. And to see so many, and they're here tonight, but to see so many young people rising up and striking the board to say, I will not serve. This is my battle, this is my body, this is my fight, this is my word. To me, is just, I be inspired. I was very cross with two young women who I thought through tomato sauce till I remembered that painting was covered by glass, and they said, oh, thank Christ for that. That'll do all right, yours. Right on. But I'd be amazed. I'd be amazed at the creativity, the humanity, and the courage of young women and young men in the face of a world that is tougher and harder, and the penalties greater, and the rewards less. Well, maybe I just don't get invited to the pub early at my age. But I do think the battle is harder. I think we were in the 60s when the movement of society was to the left. And young people are working and battling when the movement of the world is to the right. So I personally think you're doing a great job, myself. Thank you very much, everybody, and good night.